When you have finished recording, you may hang up or press 1 for more options.
Hello, is this on? I've been really enjoying your podcast series called Speech from the Throne. Liam, I don't know what happened to you as a child, but the amount of times you bring up red meat is a little bit concerning. What I think you should do is I think you should come to one of my 5-star hotels and try out some of our red meat steaks. They're tremendous. They're wonderful. You're going to love it. You like a rare? You like a medium? We have it in all different types. Okay? Anyways, I got a lot of things to do right now.
Hi, I'm Jacob Kenny.
And I'm Liam McPherson.
It's the newest edition of your first-year Devil's Advocate Poli-Sci students' favorite podcast.
It's Speech from the Throne, episode 22. We're here to bring you the latest and the greatest from the halls of power.
But not with another death threat the police decide isn't direct enough to investigate. We're just here to argue. And hey, Liam, what are we arguing about today?
Well, Jacob, a recurrent theme on this podcast is the rise of right-wing populism. And what comes with that rise of populism is a rise of online vitriol. Since social media was invented, it's made it easier for you to tell the guy or gal or whoever that you don't like behind a screen with no consequences whatsoever. People online can be nasty. We particularly see that on places like Twitter, but now it's getting to the point where journalists are experiencing something of a reckoning with one segment of the public mostly. And I think trust in media went down quite a bit after the Trump years began, and that's really hurt them. And I think we could tie politicians to that. When Trump started talking about draining the swamp and the blowback from that sort of drain the swamp mentality, the way he framed it, it had a racist tinge, it had a misogynist tinge. So the blowback is mostly targeted at BIPOC politicians and journalists and women politicians and journalists. There are a number of these cases that we've seen crop up in recent years. There is a Labour backbencher member of parliament in Britain named Joe Cox that was killed in broad daylight by some loony who supported a right-wing populist movement called Britain First. He yelled Britain First as he killed her. And on a slightly less severe scale, but still horrific, we have Catherine McKenna, a former cabinet minister under Trudeau, who through much of her tenure and to this day, I imagine, receives death threats. She's harassed in public with her family. One time she was out with her family and some guy slowed down and told her to go fuck herself because she was climate Barbie or something like that. And that isn't the first time that's happened. It's happened quite frequently.
Is it okay if I interrupt, Liam? Because I actually have a personal story. When I was campaigning with Catherine McKenna, she and her two daughters were out door knocking, and I was with her. This was not during a campaign. It was in between the campaigns after the Liberal victory in 2015. And I remember that Kathleen Wynne was still the Premier of Ontario, and there's a lot of confusion in people's minds as to where the Liberal Party of Ontario ends and the Liberal Party of Canada begins. And so I remember door knocking, and Catherine McKenna and her two kids were literally just a couple doors away. I said to the guy, "Hey, I'm door knocking with Catherine McKenna, and we're wondering if we can get your support for the Liberal Party." And he said, "I'm never going to support that B word or Kathleen Wynne and those C words that are working for her," and just this huge tirade of the worst misogynistic language you can possibly imagine. Again, all within earshot of Catherine McKenna and her little girls. Just could not care less. Says it to our faces and then slams the door. And it's visceral. And the worst thing is not only is he screaming at us, he's screaming at the wrong people. He was angry at Kathleen Wynne. He wasn't even directed at the correct party. And that was quite.
Here's where I say that politicians bear responsibility for raising the temperature when it comes to this stuff. The reason that there's no distinction in this man's mind between Kathleen Wynne and Catherine McKenna is because the Tories spent years telling people that it was one and the same. And, the Liberals have also done the same thing, trying to scare people into certain provincial PCs being like the federal conservatives, which isn't
tying Doug Ford with and more Andrew Scheer is more Doug
to
Ford.
quite devastating effect. And so it's been done. All parties have done it, but this is the consequence when that kind of meets a tide of right wing populism that was started by Brexit, that was started by Trump, that was started by all of that sort of mid 2010s kind of upheaval, and now we're really seeing the consequences. So we talked about Catherine McKenna, we talked about Joe Cox. At the provincial level, you touched on Kathleen Wynne as well just now. She faced some horrific, misogynistic, homophobic blowback due to her mistakes in office. We should have been critiquing Kathleen Wynne about her mistakes in office. We shouldn't be critiquing her about her sexuality, about her gender, about anything of that regard. But she faced a ton of that. Alison Redford, Rachel Notley, they've faced horrible threats to the point where Brian Jean, the nut bar in chief these days in Alberta, had to beg people to stop sending Rachel Notley death threats. So where does this end? I don't understand where this ends. Most recently today, why we're talking about this past week, Global News journalist Rachel Gilmore, journalist Erica Eifel, and some others on Twitter revealed to their followers that they have been the target of a coordinated campaign of harassment from at least one individual. It's the same individual. He frequently claims to convene his friends where they discuss various sexual assaults they'd like to carry out on these women. They use racial slurs. They use misogynistic slurs. This has been repeated for months. This isn't just weeks. This is months of the same individual who switches his Proton mail every time one gets shut down, because they started trying to report his email. That got shut down, and he would make another one. And then he'd make another one. Then he'd make another one. Finally, Rachel Gilmore had enough. She decided to call Ottawa police to report the death threat. She sat on hold for hours, had to call back the next day, called back the next day, reported the death threat, tried to explain that it was a coordinated campaign against her and other women and journalists of color, and was promptly asked by the dispatcher, "Ma'am, can I talk, please?" when she was trying to explain her detailed story. She also explained that she was directly named in several of these emails, often with a misogynistic epithet beside her name, and the dispatcher responded, "So you weren't directly mentioned?" And she's like, no, I was. I just said that. There's a whole video online, folks. You can go on Rachel Gilmore's Twitter and watch this. There's a whole video of her call. And, listen, I'm not saying that this particular individual at the Ottawa Police is responsible for the systemic failures of policing, but nothing showcases the systemic failures of policing and how they victimize victims than this video. It's so blatant how they make the victim feel as if it's their burden to report, and, well, we'll do something if we can get to it, but I doubt we can do anything about it. And so finally an officer followed up with Rachel Gilmore about her report, and he said, apparently according to Gilmore, he sounded frustrated, but he basically said there was nothing they could do. So nothing gets done, and now her and her BIPOC and female colleagues, who also reported this allegation to the Toronto police and they did nothing, have to live with months more of harassment from these knuckle draggers. So my question to you, Jacob, is where do we get off? Journalists have obviously, at least in the 20th century, have had a history of falling into this corporate model of journalism that encourages them to both sides everything when they're not really supposed to do that, and it's not morally. Journalism is a moral calling, in my opinion, and when there's a moral reason to not both sides something, it's important that you stand on that moral soapbox. And for a while, journalists didn't. They tried to both sides everything. I think that hurt them. I think it should have hurt them. But not only have we seen since the Trump years journalists trying to speak with a more free voice, remember there are journalists all across the political spectrum, we have seen the rise of hate through a misogynistic and racist lens being targeted at people who are just trying to do their jobs and who are increasingly, aside from some exceptions at major outlets, trying to speak with their own voice. So where do we get off, Jacob? What do you think of all this?
Well, I don't know where we're going to end this problem, because I think it's just getting worse. And to be perfectly honest, if we're trying to rely on the police to defend journalists, we've already lost. The only one that's going to defend a leftist is another leftist. The police are never going to step in to protect progressives, because progressives are the ones that are arguing against the powers of the state. The progressives are the ones that are arguing against the powers of our capitalist structures. And it makes no sense for the police, whose only job basically is to maintain our structures of discrimination and prejudice, that they're ever going to protect the people that are dismantling it. And so for a long time, before World War I or World War II, during the invention of the newspaper phase, it was very common for there to be a subscription model where they had a left-wing newspaper that was supported by left-wing subscribers. There'd be a right-wing newspaper that was supported by right-wing subscribers. And the two sides hated each other, but no one could really afford to buy too many newspapers that belonged to the other side because they were expensive. And so we never had this cross-contamination where people were aware of the opinionists or the columnists of the other side and then would go out and try to attack them. With the mass media model of the current age, where journalists are still trying to play to both sides, particularly with Global. Now, you can say Rachel Gilmore is a little more on the left, but Global is definitely not like a left-wing organization. It's a capitalist organization. It wants to make money, and to make money in an advertising model, you got to advertise to the widest population possible. And so that necessarily means it's going to be sending her stories to people that otherwise would not be inclined to read it. And that's just kind of a recipe for violence. And so if you want a way to avoid this, I think journalists need to start recognizing the side that they're playing to. That the old idea of, or I shouldn't say old, because it's really just an aberration. It's something that happened after World War II. The idea that you could remove politics from the news, that you could only tell stories in an quote-unquote unbiased way that could be marketed to every segment of the population was always a bit of a fantasy. It was always based on huge swaths of the population being suppressed in what they could or could not say. There was an artificial consensus. And now that artificial consensus has broken down, that there is much more of a debate, definitely a debate in areas like, we're talking about women's rights or the rights of minorities, debates that we probably should not be having, quite frankly, that we would hope had been settled 50 years ago, that seem to be coming up again. Now that everything is becoming contentious once again, there's no mass market message. And more importantly, I don't think it's necessary anymore. We're able to advertise to increasingly particular segments of the population. It's not even becoming super profitable to have a mass market audience anymore. And as you were saying in the pre-discussion, like many journalists are leaving the mass market advertiser-driven model and moving towards subscription models. I think it has to be done that way. The only people that are going to protect you as a journalist are the people on your camp. They're your subscribers. The old idea of I'm going to defend the capitalist system and the capitalist system is going to defend me back, i.e. the police, is silly. They're not going to defend you. The police are not there to help you. The police are there to help your company, but they're certainly not there to help you, the journalist. And I think people are starting to realize that. Now, is this necessarily an ultimate solution? I'm just basically advocating for more polarization, sadly. But I think as a way to protect yourself, it's the only way that the journalists are going to be able to survive in this method. You need to know who your people are. I do think that the prevalence of misogyny and these racist attacks as well against journalists is sort of proof that they're not fostering correctly a left-wing protection. That misogynists and racists feel so free to attack because they're not getting challenged, they're not getting contested. And that's what we need. We need to have people that are fighting back. And I really appreciate Rachel Gilmore for bringing that up to the subscribers, for showing, this is the threat. And now I think, people like you and I, Liam, and other progressives, we need to do our due diligence and respond to the threat by, when we see someone going after journalists, when we see people attacking someone on Twitter, we have to do our part and say that's not acceptable. We can't just sit back and call the police and hope that they deal with it. We have to be the ones that are out there protecting journalists. Now, yeah, maybe that is a recipe for more polarization. It's true. But at the end of the day, you cannot allow the enemy to maintain the whole field of battle. You have to contest them. You have to show that we will not accept or tolerate this level of discussion without some sort of conflict. You have to be able to show that we're not going to be pushed over. We're not going to let you just destroy the only people that are trying to report the truth. If one side is already fighting, it's not an option to just lay down our arms and pretend the war isn't here. The war is here, and now we have to start fighting it.
I think you hit on a lot of good stuff there. And I mean, basically where this starts is, in journalism school, they beat into my head and all of our heads, your duty as a journalist is to the truth. And I'm not sure what other colleagues of mine took that as, because a lot of journalists historically, particularly in decades like pre this one, have tried to both sides everything, and that's been the truth. Sometimes, and this is the way that I took the lesson in journalism school, the truth demands you morally to take a side. Some issues, like journalism, are inherently tied to politics. And when something is tied to politics, you're not going to get a consistent side. You're not going to get a consistent answer. And you might happen to write a piece with the Liberals and the Tories where maybe the Liberals are morally in the wrong. And then you might write another piece where the Tories are morally in the wrong. But historically, these have been both sided. Or maybe one issue has been minimized to make it seem like it's weighted similarly to the other issue. We can't be doing that anymore. If the truth is that Indigenous people in Canada have been deprived of clean water for decades on end, centuries perhaps, then that's the truth. If the truth is that we have families living on welfare or in trailers or tents in Nova Scotia on the South Shore, that's the truth. You can't sugarcoat that. And I think you have a moral duty to the truth that you tell it. You don't sugarcoat it. You don't balance it. You tell the truth. And I think more and more journalists are starting to do that unabashedly, like you're saying, as a response to this rising tide of hate. And I know what you mean, Jacob. It is unfortunate that you sort of have to ratchet up the culture war dial. But I'm similar to you. Like, of course, if there was a world where we couldn't have a culture war, that would be wonderful. But getting back to the whole moral duty, we have a moral duty to call these things out. So if one side is screaming and shouting over the other one, we need to start defending them. And I find it simultaneously empowering and disturbing, to be honest with you. I find it empowering that some of this stuff is being returned to our hands as the people, but then I find it disturbing that that's because our system has failed and there's no adequate regulation method to ensure stuff like this doesn't happen. That's what I find disturbing, especially in a country like Canada, but I find it empowering that more and more people are waking up to the way that some of these people, journalists and politicians, are being treated. How are we going to recruit politicians in this country? Who's going to feel safe in their job now? We've had MPs' offices receive poison in envelopes like multiple times across the past 20 years since 9/11 that's happened. We've had politicians get death threats. We've had politicians get insulted based on their race, their sex, whatever. If you don't like a politician, vote them out. Go to a protest. Whatever you want. Exercise your right to protest. I don't care. Don't harass their families, harass them, harass their staff. Don't do that. Why are you doing that? What do you think that's going to accomplish? It's not going to accomplish what you think. In fact, all it's going to do is wake up more people, including us, to the problem. So what's the solution here? How can we deal with this if police aren't going to step in? Like, what do you think, Jacob? I mean, is yelling on Twitter enough?
I think that journalists need to decide what the purpose of the information that they're giving to the public is. If you're looking under the old advertising model, the purpose of giving an article, the purpose of making a news clip is just to get eyeballs on the screen. It's just to drag you in as long as possible so you can see as many ads. And so, like, you can see if let's go back to the Rachel Gilmore example. You could see a version of her story where she would want to do that, where she would say, like, oh, these are these people that are attacking me, and I don't like that very much. But also, they also have their own opinion, and they're growing up in their own culture, and so, here's my side of the story, here's their side of the story, and at the end of the day, that basically just leaves you with, oh, okay, well, I guess both sides are equally valid, so I'm just going to keep reading to uncover more of the story, but I don't, as a reader, have any other action left to me besides just continuing to read. And if your goal is to market eyeballs, then that's the goal. The problem is, with that type of journalism, the public isn't using that information to improve society. They're just using that information to improve your bottom line. If, however, you're a journalist who wants to give information to the public so that they can use that information to make a genuine improvement to society, and maybe you're a conservative journalist and your idea of improving society is very radically different than my left-wing idea of improving society. But in general, you want to give someone a particular narrative or particular story so that they can use these facts as a way of helping a political goal. Then you can actually go somewhere. And I think that's what Rachel Gilmore did. She didn't just paint both sides here and say, oh, this is my experience, but here's the other person's experience. It was no, I am being attacked, and now I need to be defended. Now, I think you saw that, and you're like, okay, I need to make a whole episode about this. When you and I were debating beforehand whether or not we should even do an episode this week, like, you felt a call to action. And that's what we need. We need citizens to be, looking at a story and getting a genuine call to action. The problem is that you're never going to get there with the traditional set of journalistic standards, because a call to action is always based off of a subjective morality. It's like you can always describe the facts of the situation in a relatively unbiased perspective. Like, there's obviously you have to use some sort of notion of, this is based off of the notion of like a Western empiricism, and so you're fundamentally, even ontologically, you're never really going to be able to argue. You're never going to be able to get an unbiased determination of fact. But anyways, let's just say you can say what the fact universe is relatively politically neutrally, but the way that you actualize that information, the way that you take that information and make a difference in the world, that's always going to be politically subjective. And that's the part that I think a lot of people miss. Like, they're reading everything, oh, climate change is ruining the world, but they don't know what the hell to do about it. And that's the part that journalists are not filling people in on. They're giving you facts, but you need to give them a direction. You need to show them what to do. So you're saying like, oh, politicians are in danger and stuff. Well, that's because there aren't any people around them protecting them. The funny thing is that even though we're in this hyper-partisan, hyper-polarized environment, there's actually a relatively small number of people that are on Twitter making the arguments. There's a relatively small number of people that are in these marches, in these rallies. I think the real story of this political moment is that there's a whole bunch of people that are tuned out entirely. There's far fewer people are joining political parties, for example. Far fewer people are subscribed to newspapers. Far fewer people are far fewer people are voting in general. Fewer people are participating in the system. And it's because they have no fucking idea what to do. They see all these problems, but they're given no solutions. If journalists said, here's the problem, here's what you need to do about it, here's the guy you need to vote to support, then you would have people coming out of their houses and actually supporting these politicians, building a human wall around them so that no one is going to shoot them. That's the only way you protect people. You need people protect other people. You can never rely on the police. You can never rely on anything else. It's people protecting themselves. And in order for that to happen, they need a coherent narrative. They need a structure. They need to have a mission. And you're not going to get that with the current journalistic model. You need to be able to show, here's the problem, here's the solution, here's the direction that we go in. And until we get there, it is going to be more dangerous for the journalists and the politicians themselves. But if they can craft a side and know where they're on, know the general direction, they can be safe. You're always safe in numbers. You're always safer in a particular side. And that's the difficulty. We haven't figured out what side we're on yet in the journalist world. The right wing knows what side they're on. They know big time what side they're on. And it's not a good side. We need to have the same sort of discussion in the left. And it's difficult for us to do in the left because during the Cold War, the Americans did a good job of basically killing all the Bolsheviks and then jailing all the anarchists. And so there's like the organizations and where to go to are very fragmented, and liberals are still sticking their toes in whether they want to maintain the policies of capitalism or socialism. And so it's a much more fragmented picture on the left than it is on the right in the Western world. And I think that's fundamentally our problem, is we're not protecting ourselves, basically, because we all have these little ideological disagreements, and so we're just watching as one progressive journalist gets attacked, and we're like, well, they're not progressive enough for me, so I'm not going to stand up for them. It's not acceptable. We got to stand up for everyone all the time. That's the only way we keep ourselves safe.
Yeah, and I mean, you speak of this antiquated model, I speak of this antiquated model. We've seen journalists start to move away from this. So we've got Paul Wells, he's started his own Substack. If you don't know what Substack is, it's a service that allows writers and journalists and authors to independently share their work through a subscription-based model. So we've got Paul Wells on Substack now. We've got Christopher Curtis, formerly of the Montreal Gazette. He's on Substack.
Former guest of the show.
Former guest of the pod, that's right. We've got Jen Gerson on Substack, along with Matt Gurney, I believe. So Jen and Matt contribute to sort of collaboration called The Line. That's their Substack. So, and they're not necessarily lefties either. They're, I would say, center-right. So it's across the spectrum we're seeing this move to independent platforms. Now, there are still many legacy journalists that I keep tabs on, and many wonderful legacy journalists who are able to cover issues well, but I think we'll be seeing less and less of legacy media. You know, Canada Land, that's Jesse Brown's organization, has blown up in the past, you know, I would say even 5 years, like since they did their Thunder Bay series there about 5 years ago, like that really, and then they did White Saviors.
And they're fantastic. I honestly can't, White Saviors was amazing. If you thought the We Charity stuff was bad just because of their connection with the Liberal Party, like it's so much worse.
So, you know, these are the things that
learned that without Canada
exactly. These are the things that are now coming to light now that we have bold, independent journalism that isn't beholden to a corporate agenda. And I know that you'll hear a lot of right-wing populists say that the reason they don't like mainstream media is because it has a corporate agenda. And though their views on what constitutes a corporate agenda and what constitutes fake news are deeply, deeply flawed because of a complete lack of media literacy, they are correct that corporations have muddied the waters when it comes to journalism in a lot of cases.
Yep.
So it's helpful to regain public trust if more journalists move to this kind of model, or if they don't want to move, if they start writing this way. However, they still need people to stand up to the wave of hate. That's not going to subside. Hell, it's being fundraised on. Have you ever seen like a Conservative Party of Canada email during a term of Parliament, a session of Parliament? It's angry. Have you seen a Pierre Poilievre fundraising email about defunding the CBC? It's angry. There's politicians that stoke this for fundraising, which in turn emboldens them, and then the police do nothing, which in turn emboldens them further. And that is the problem. We're drifting towards something that's not sustainable. There's already been a woman killed in the UK. I do think it's just a matter of time until someone gets hurt or killed. And I know that Michael Wernick said this during the SNC-Lavalin trial as part of his weird, coy defense of what he didn't do during the SNC-Lavalin incident. I don't know why I said trial. SNC-Lavalin hearings. Yeah. So I don't, he was kind of using it like, oh, people are going to get killed as to why like people shouldn't be upset about SNC-Lavalin. So that didn't land, but he is right that somebody's going to get killed. Like, it's going to happen. Yeah. It's only a matter of time till some loony shows up to the PM's door. Somebody tried last summer. He showed up with a truck loaded full of weapons and was stopped by the Mounties, thank God. But, like, someone's going to get killed or hurt. And politicians who fundraise on this stuff have blood on their hands. They will have blood on their hands. And if we care to never see this kind of politics return again, we should do everything in our power to make sure that politicians who fundraise off of this bullshit are never allowed to get a job in this country again.
So the traditional model of a political party, as it was crafted in the late 19th century, early 20th century, had three elements. There is a bureaucratic part that offered services to the population, a political part that's meant to win elections, and a terrorist organization that's meant to overthrow the government. Now, in the West, we don't have many parties that have links to those terrorist organizations, although there actually are a few socialist parties still in Europe that used to run terrorist organizations. And in the 20s and 30s, terrorist organizations that were linked with either like the Bolsheviks, that were linked with or fascists or nationalists, killed thousands and thousands and thousands of public figures. I mean, like you named one political assassination, but in many ways, we're actually very lucky to be living in an incredibly peaceful time politically, because in more tumultuous periods, like in Japan, when there was, before the Pacific War started, before Japan invaded China, there was a huge fight basically over whether or not they were going to move towards ultranationalism or whether they should just stay in the Japanese home islands and become more of a regular Western democracy. And the prime ministers were getting assassinated like every week. There was constant turmoil of people were getting members of their parliament constantly getting shot. And before the Russian Revolution, for example, I think the year before the Russian Revolution, there was something like 5,000 local governors were killed. So and local officials, and it was an absolute bloodbath. And so if we let this thing get out of control, it can get out of control super fast. And right now we're seeing, I think on the right wing, we are seeing that they are developing these terrorist organizations again that are working in concert, we can't prove they're working in concert with existing political parties, but we can guess from the history of these political movements that there probably are some links. So we're seeing there's right now there's a cult basically that just bought a church that I used to live very close beside in the Byward Market in Ottawa. There's this old derelict church. It's less than a kilometer away from Parliament. It got bought out by a Freedom Convoy-linked Christian cultist organization called the United People of Canada. It has these giant, terrifying Nazi red banners in front of their church with these really weird Orwellian logos, and it's so bizarre because it seems transparently obvious what they're selling. First, they brought people in to talk about the causes of the Freedom Convoy, and they said, "Oh, we're helping the community." And now they just said that they're going to build a private security detail without a license. They're just building a private security force to quote unquote protect the church. And again, so we have a convoy-linked organization. We don't know where this money came from, but they bought a church less than a kilometer away from Parliament, and now they're building a quote-unquote security organization. Come on, guys. Do we not see what's happening here? They're building a militia.
Did you hear about the police? The police proactively checked in and was like, okay, if you're going to set up a private security force, make sure you do X, Y, Z, and then left.
Yeah.
As far as we know, with a major underline, they're not breaking any laws at the moment, but it's highly suspicious, particularly given the fact that they're affiliated with the Freedom Convoy and they want to have a national discussion, but they can't do that without having some sort of brutish security force. It's just it's very brazen what the positioning of this organization is.
It's very clear that they're planning for a coup in Canada, and they're trying to fund a militia that will eventually be used to take over the government. I don't know if they're ever going to succeed in that, but it's painfully obvious what the goals of that church is. Painfully obvious, and it's ridiculous to me that we cannot say that in public and we cannot shut these people down. I don't know how we can possibly allow it, and I think this just goes back to the previous podcast we were talking about a lack of religious education. I think anyone that has any sort of knowledge of actual religious intentions can look at their site and say these guys have nothing to do with it with any sort of religious agenda. It's very clearly a Freedom Convoy political movement. That kills me, because I used to live 3 blocks from this place. The world is gotten so crazy so fast, and the Americans have had these militia, these free roaming militia for a long time, and they've also killed people for a long time. This linked to a podcast after Roe v. Wade was overturned that said since after Roe v. Wade was passed in the early 1970s, there have been 12 abortion doctors who've been assassinated by extremist Christian terrorists in the United States. And also in the 1990s, on CNN allowed, just goes back to the both sides journalism, CNN allowed an extremist Christian advocate to go onto their national broadcast and debate whether or not it was morally acceptable to shoot abortion doctors. He was allowed to do that. He was allowed to say that God sanctified the killing of abortion doctors. And big surprise, people listened to him do it and killed abortion doctors. This is not something you can both sides. There's one side that wants to very violently overthrow our society and turn it into some sort of, very extreme Christo-fascism, as you described it before. And there's another side that doesn't want to do that. So I don't think that's a both sides argument. I think there's clearly an enemy of sanity that needs to be stopped, and there's one side that's willing to do the stopping. You can't just sit on the fence in this case. You cannot do it.
And hopefully, listeners, that helps you get off the fence if you were on it before. Obviously, a difficult conversation to have, but an important one, and difficult shouldn't be stopping us from having these conversations. I'm glad that I had the chance to do it with Jacob. I'm glad that I thought of it, because we were initially thinking of taking this week off just for a little vacation break, but we like to keep the consistency of the program up if we can.
And these right-wing adjectives, they do not take a vacation. They don't.
Nice.
Don't take vacation.
He's right. It's true. And now, look, if you want to hear more of this, if you have ideas for future episodes, if you have thoughts, you can share it with us at speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. That's speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. Also, spare a thought for Kiska the whale. She's the last orca whale in captivity in Canada. She's 45. She's trapped at Marineland in a 40 by 20 meter tank. And they're trying to get her out to a sanctuary out in Nova Scotia. So spare a thought for her today. We need to get her back to where she belongs. And with that, I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Bye.